11 president/vice president pairs who didn't get along too well. Throughout American political history, numerous White House feuds have arisen between presidents and their vice presidents, leading to administrations marked by deep animosity between the two. While each of these conflicts had its own specific causes, they all shared a common root. As the American executive branch developed during the 19th and 20th centuries, the vice presidency often remained a largely ceremonial role, with little influence over substantive governmental matters. Vice presidents were often chosen for their regional appeal or political connections during a campaign, but once in office they were frequently sidelined. For accomplished and ambitious politicians, this marginalization could quickly lead to resentment and bitterness. Such an environment was ripe for tension, and it's no surprise that many American presidents and vice presidents found themselves at odds. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr's antagonism changed the Electoral College. In 1800, just a decade after its inception, the American presidential electoral process encountered a significant challenge that highlighted its developmental flaws. After the votes were cast and electors were designated, the two Republican Party candidates, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, found themselves tied with 73 electoral votes each. At that time, political parties didn't run on a joint ticket, so electors could cast 2 votes for any of the 4 candidates. The candidate with the majority of votes would become president, while the runner-up would assume the role of vice president. For the 1800 election, the Republicans intended for Jefferson to secure the presidency and Burr the vice presidency. However, this plan unraveled when the election was thrown to the House of Representatives to break the tie. It took 36 ballots for Jefferson to finally win, largely due to some Federalists in Congress, prompted by Alexander Hamilton, choosing to abstain, thereby giving the presidency to Jefferson. As a result, Burr became vice president by default, but Jefferson, suspecting that Burr had tried to claim the presidency for himself during the drawn-out voting process, immediately sidelined him. Burr's requests for cabinet appointments were ignored, and he was swiftly isolated within the administration. By 1804, it was clear he would not be part of the next ticket. Burr's political fortunes worsened after his unsuccessful 1804 campaign for governor of New York, during which Hamilton again played a role in his defeat. Frustrated and enraged, Burr challenged Hamilton to the infamous duel that ended Hamilton's life and turned Burr into a political outcast. Bitter and alienated from American politics, Burr left the United States and concocted a reckless scheme to seize control of Western territories and crown himself leader of a new nation. The plot failed before it could even begin, and Jefferson's animosity led to Burr being charged with treason. The president fully intended to see his former vice president hanged, but Burr was acquitted, thanks to Chief Justice John Marshall, who insisted on a very high standard for proving guilt. Despite this, the hostility from both the political establishment and the president was so intense that Burr fled to Europe, remaining in exile for 4 years. The chaos of the 1800 election led to the passage of the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, which changed the electoral process by allowing electors to vote separately for president and vice president, preventing such confusion in the future. Andrew Jackson literally threatened to kill his VP, John Calhoun. Thomas Jefferson's pursuit of Aaron Burr wasn't the last time a president threatened the physical well-being of a vice president. John C. Calhoun, one of only 2 men to serve as vice president under different presidents, found himself in a heated conflict with Andrew Jackson. The unusual situation arose from the Electoral College's practice of holding separate elections for the president and vice president, which sometimes led to mismatched partnerships. Jackson and Calhoun's 1828 ticket against John Quincy Adams was a marriage of convenience, but their relationship quickly soured, particularly over the issue of tariffs that Calhoun believed unfairly discriminated against Southern states in favor of the North. The conflict escalated when Calhoun invoked the concept of nullification, arguing that states could ignore federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. Calhoun even threatened secession from the Union, prompting Jackson to seek congressional approval for the 1833 Force Bill, which authorized the use of military force to ensure state compliance with federal law. By this time, Calhoun had resigned as vice president in December 1832 and returned to the Senate. During the height of the dispute, Jackson reportedly declared, "John Calhoun, if you secede from my nation, I will secede your head from the rest of your body." Given Jackson's reputation, having participated in up to 100 duels during his lifetime, he probably wasn't joking. John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson's massive egos made for a difficult relationship. In 1960, John F. Kennedy secured the Democratic nomination for president after a fiercely competitive primary, where his main rival was Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson. Johnson, a formidable senator known for his aggressive tactics, attacked Kennedy's Catholic faith and questioned his health in an effort to win the nomination. Recognizing the tough road ahead in the general election, Kennedy chose to put Johnson on the ticket, a decision that likely helped him win the presidency. However, once in office, Kennedy's administration, dominated by Northeastern intellectuals, marginalized Johnson, excluding him from any significant role in the government. The president rarely met with him, and Attorney General Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, frequently clashed with Johnson, sometimes even in public. Johnson found himself relegated to diplomatic trips abroad, a task he saw as a deliberate attempt to sideline and humiliate him. This treatment fostered a deep-seated resentment in Johnson, which came to a head after Kennedy's assassination. When Jackie Kennedy and other officials returned to Air Force One to fly back to Washington, they found Johnson already in the president's cabin, having declined Jackie's request to leave the space for her one last time. This moment symbolized the final rift in a relationship that had long been strained, leaving Johnson embittered but indifferent to the Kennedys. After all, he was now the president. Al Gore blamed Bill Clinton for his 2000 defeat. By October 2000, the relationship between Al Gore and Bill Clinton had completely deteriorated, with the two no longer even speaking to each other. Once close allies during their successful presidential campaigns, their bond began to fray as Clinton's second term became mired in scandal. By 1999, Gore had publicly criticized Clinton's behavior regarding his affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky and privately resented the influence and authority granted to Hillary Clinton, feeling it diminished his own role. Clinton, in turn, grew frustrated with Gore's refusal to campaign with him and suspected that Gore was determined to prove he could win the presidency on his own. After Gore narrowly lost the 2000 election, he blamed Clinton's personal misconduct for his defeat, leading to a tense confrontation at the White House in December 2000. Though their relationship eventually improved, particularly after September 11, the rift during that crucial election year was significant. Franklin D. Roosevelt may have run for a third term to prevent his VP from being elected president. FDR initially had a good relationship with his straightforward vice president, John Nance Garner. Garner, a tough, hard-drinking Texan, famously remarked that the vice presidency wasn't worth a pitcher of warm piss. Known as Cactus Jack for his sharp wit, Garner eventually became disillusioned with FDR's liberal New Deal policies, which clashed with his more conservative views. As the 1940 election approached, Garner, then in his 70s, saw it as his last chance to pursue the presidency. His isolationist stance on foreign policy and belief that federal troops should have been used to suppress labor strikes in the late 30s further distanced him from Roosevelt, whose support base included labor unions. When Garner decided to challenge Roosevelt for the Democratic nomination, he was outmaneuvered by FDR, who allowed himself to be drafted as a candidate, sidestepping criticism for breaking the unwritten, two-term tradition. Garner retired from politics and returned to Texas, thinking his time was nearly up. However, he went on to live another 27 years, passing away in 1967 at the age of 98. Fate forced Theodore Roosevelt on William McKinley. William McKinley was never particularly fond of Teddy Roosevelt. He believed that Roosevelt's loud calls for war were more about boosting his political credentials than genuine concern for the country. Despite his reservations, McKinley appointed Roosevelt as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a position that Roosevelt used to aggressively advocate for war with Spain. Privately, after McKinley expressed his hesitation to enter a conflict, Roosevelt derisively remarked that the president had all the backbone of a chocolate eclair. McKinley, who had first-hand experience of the horrors of war from his time in the Civil War, eventually did ask Congress to declare war. Roosevelt quickly secured a commission as a lieutenant colonel in the Rough Riders and wasted no time in capitalizing on the moment. He was outfitted in a Brooks Brothers uniform and issued a press release complete with numerous photographs of himself in military attire, before he had even left New York for Puerto Rico. Roosevelt's self-promotion might have been a minor irritation had it not been for an unforeseen development that would change American history. McKinley's trusted vice president, Garrett Hobart, died of heart disease in December 1899. Roosevelt, who had alienated party bosses in New York, was seen as a problem best solved by placing him in the largely powerless role of vice president, where McKinley could keep him at arm's length. Although Roosevelt initially resisted the idea, he eventually agreed, seeing it as a way to escape potential political defeat in New York. His first 6 months as vice president were uneventful, as expected. But everything changed when an assassin shot and killed President McKinley in September 1901, thrusting the man nobody wanted into the presidency. Dwight Eisenhower thought Richard Nixon was an overly ambitious weirdo. Dwight Eisenhower's relationship with his vice president, Richard Nixon, was strained from the start. Nixon was chosen as the running mate at the convention, a decision Eisenhower wasn't enthusiastic about. He was wary of Nixon's aggressive anti-communist rhetoric and his relentless ambition. By 1956, with Eisenhower's health in question, the decision about who would join him on the ticket became crucial. Eisenhower subtly tried to encourage Nixon to step aside and accept a cabinet position instead, but Nixon didn't take the hint. Ultimately, Nixon remained on the ticket, but Eisenhower's disdain for him was evident both privately and publicly. During a 1956 conversation with party officials, Eisenhower remarked, "I can't understand how a man can come so far in his profession and not have any friends." Then, in a 1960 press conference, when asked to name a Nixon idea he had adopted during his presidency, Eisenhower quipped, "If you give me a week, I might think of one." I don't remember. Though intended as a joke, the comment was a sharp and damaging reflection of Eisenhower's true feelings. Eisenhower's passive-aggressive relationship with Nixon was anything but subtle. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were from different political parties. It was almost inevitable that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson would clash as president and vice president. Adams, a Federalist, and Jefferson, a Republican, represented opposing political ideologies, with their election outcome dictated by the system where the runner-up in electoral votes became vice president, regardless of party alignment. The Federalists and Republicans were deeply divided on key issues, particularly their stances toward England and France, and views on civil liberties. Although Adams and Jefferson maintained a civil personal relationship during Adams's presidency, tensions rose when Adams made last-minute appointments of Federalists to key positions before Jefferson's inauguration. Jefferson saw this as a deliberate effort to undermine his upcoming administration, leading him to cease communication with Adams for a decade. Their friendship was eventually revived in 1811 after the intervention of a mutual friend, and they maintained a warm correspondence until their deaths, which coincidentally occurred on the same day, July 4, 1826. Richard Nixon wanted to get rid of Spiro Agnew because he considered him a lightweight. Initially, Richard Nixon was pleased with his running mate, Spiro, Ted, Agnew, who campaigned effectively in the closely contested 1968 election. However, their relationship quickly deteriorated due to Nixon's dissatisfaction with Agnew's governance, his abrasive attitude towards the press, and what Nixon saw as a lack of depth. By 1972, Nixon wanted to replace Agnew, but by then, Agnew had secured strong support from the far-right conservative faction of the party, using colorful terms like impudent snobs and nattering nabobs of negativism to criticize media that were hostile to Republicans. Under normal circumstances, Nixon might have been indifferent when Agnew was forced to resign in October 1973 due to bribery and extortion charges from his time as governor of Maryland. However, Nixon was already embroiled in the Watergate scandal, and Agnew's resignation further tarnished Nixon's administration, intensifying public suspicions of corruption. After Agnew's departure, the two men never spoke again, with Agnew refusing Nixon's attempts at reconciliation. Calvin Coolidge got angry with Charles Dawes when the VP slept in. Charles Dawes wasn't Calvin Coolidge's first choice for vice president during Coolidge's 1924 re-election campaign. The position had originally been offered to another politician who declined. Dawes's outspoken and stubborn demeanor clashed with the reserved nature of President Coolidge, often called Silent Cal. His reputation suffered further when he slept through a crucial Senate vote on a Coolidge nominee, turning him into a public laughingstock. Feeling slighted, Coolidge, who decided not to seek re-election in 1928, made it clear that nominating Dawes in that election would be a personal affront. Consequently, the party chose Herbert Hoover instead. Richard Johnson was so bad, Van Buren wouldn't even pick a VP. Martin Van Buren's vice president, Richard Johnson, is often considered one of the least effective VPs in U.S. history. Johnson's incompetence was so notable that Van Buren chose not to select a running mate in his failed 1840 re-election bid. Though Johnson was a war hero, reputed to have killed Native American Chief Tecumseh in the War of 1812, his common-law marriage to a slave, with whom he fathered 2 children, was a scandal that hindered his political career. Legally barred from marrying her, the relationship further damaged his chances with the Electoral College, leading to his election by the Senate instead. Johnson, who was financially struggling in 1837, took a 9-month leave to run a bar and hotel in Kentucky. By the 1840 election, even Andrew Jackson, Johnson's former supporter, acknowledged that Johnson needed to be replaced. Rather than officially drop a war hero in the election against William Henry Harrison, the party avoided naming a vice presidential candidate, hoping Van Buren might be re-elected with the Electoral College or Senate selecting a new VP. The voters resolved the issue by decisively defeating Van Buren and electing Harrison as the 9th president.